All right, thank you for joining me tonight, everyone, for this one night stand presentation. This is a series of presentations that we do at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, where we focus on one work of art and one artist for one night. Tonight, I'll be discussing Jacques Callot's Varie figure Gobbi, or various hunchbacked figures, using the language of the time, which is a series of 21 engravings and etchings created by the artist in 1616 and likely printed a little bit later. These vary a little bit in size from one to the other, but they're all roughly around 2.5 by 3.5 inches. And these are on display right now in the exhibition Tiny Wonders, Small Scale Works from the Collection, which is on view until September 1st. So you do have a little bit of time left to check these out in person. And I hope I'm able to tell you something tonight that makes you interested to go see these in person. So before we come back to these and discuss them in a little bit more detail, I wanted to talk a bit about Callot's background first. And here's a portrait of him by another artist, an engraving of him. Callot was printmaker during the 17th century. He was born in the Duchy of Lorraine, which is part of modern-day France, in 1592. And he's from a well-to-do family. So he was the son of the herald and master of ceremonies at the court of Lorraine. When he began to be interested in the arts, he became apprenticed to a Nuncy silversmith and engraver in 1607. And then a few years later, he traveled to Rome to work on his engraving there. And while he was in Rome, he was learning from an expatriate Frenchman, Philippe Thomasin. And here you're seeing a work by Philippe on your screen right now. And so he's learning engraving while he's there. He's spending his time in Rome. And shortly after that, in 1612, he goes on to Florence. And that's where he begins to etch. And he's probably studying etching with Antonio Tempesta in Florence. And this is probably a good point to kind of pause and talk a little bit about printmaking. So I've already mentioned two printmaking processes, engraving and etching. And I just wanted to briefly talk about the difference between those two. So very quickly and in very simple terms, I encourage you, if you're interested, to look up more information on printmaking processes, and especially to watch some videos on the printmaking process. That can often be the best way to really see it and understand exactly what's happening. And you can find lots of videos like that on YouTube. So engraving is a process by which you're taking your metal plate and you're carving your design directly into the plate using a tool called a burin. And once you have your design the way you want it, you apply ink to the surface of the plate, make sure it's in all of your incised lines, really in there good. You wipe away all of the excess ink and then run it through the printing press. And then you're left with your image. Etching is a little bit different. You still have your metal plate, but in the case of that process, you're using something called a ground, which is applied to the surface of the printing plate. And that's basically like a resist. Oftentimes it might be made of wax, but there are other materials that are used as well. And what you do in that process is you actually create your image in the wax resist. And once you've created it, you're drawing your lines in that wax resist. It goes into an acid bath, and that acid will eat away at any of those lines that you created, which has then exposed that metal plate beneath. So you're creating the lines through this more chemical process in the case of etching. Once you've done that, and you can put it in the acid bath multiple times, you can add different lines, you can cover lines back up with the ground. Then you ink the plate again, similar to etching, or to engraving, excuse me, and making sure that you have ink in all of those lines, removing the excess and running it through the printing press. So when I'm using those terms, that's the things that I'm referring to, and hopefully that clarifies it a little bit. So as I was saying, he's in Florence. He's learning about etching. He's working with Antonio Tempesta, and he ends up becoming a master and independently and in his own right while he's in Florence. And then he goes on to work for the Medici court. And the Medicis, of course, were this very powerful, influential banking family and political dynasty. and great patrons of the arts as well. Um, and so here I'm showing you just one example of one of the etchings that he did, or engravings that he did that is related to the Medicis. And his work is kind of well known for showing examples of everyday life of this period. He's considered a master of expressing both the horrors and the joys of 17th century life. So he chronicled the life of the period. He featured soldiers, clowns, drunkards, gypsies, beggars, and court life as well. And he also etched many religious and military images, and many prints featured extensive landscapes in their background as well. His career was divided into this Italian period from 1609 to 1621, and then his Lorraine period from 1621 until his death. While in Italy, he worked under the direct patronage, like I said, of the Medicis, and he only returned to France after the death of Cosimo de' Medici. And here you're seeing a portrait that Callot did of Cosimo. Callot was a very prolific artist. He created 1,400 prints over his lifetime that are surviving today, and over 2,000 drawings. And he's known for making many preparatory drawings before he etched his plates as well. So I'm showing you one example here on the screen on the left, where he's created a drawing, and then a piece that perhaps he used as the final finished version based on that initial sketch. He often worked by himself, but later on he also worked with a publisher, Israel Henriette, who was a Parisian, and he published his prints. Their co-produced work that they created together can be identified by the inscription that you see at the bottom, which indicates that it was published by Henriette. So Callot has this extensive career. He's even considered the father of etching, which we'll talk more about later as well. But he has a fairly short life. He passes away in 1635 of a stomach ailment. And so returning back to the pieces that we're talking about today, this series that he did of our Les Gobbi figures, like these pieces, most of his prints were relatively small, as much as about 6 inches or 15 centimeters on their longest dimension. And in this particular series, and he did multiple series throughout his lifetime, this is focusing on a troupe of entertainers of short stature who were known as les Gobbi. At the time, using the language of the time, referred to as dwarves, but they could also be called hunchbacks or even grotesques. So probably not language that we would use today, but these are what some of these figures would be known for and how you can see them described with their original titles. These performers were performing at the Medici court, where Jacques Callot was working for the family. And they would dance and sing, and this was a very popular form of entertainment in the Baroque era. So he would have been inspired by these performers that he was seeing in the court, who were serving as jesters and players for the amusement of the court. And that's how they would have been regarded. They would have been seen as being amusing, and a troupe of dancing and singing people like this would have been regarded as this great novelty in the 17th century. So he used sketches made in Italy for these works, and there are a number of preparatory drawings of the subject that survived, including one for the title page. And as we're looking at these, they are very sketchy, and it can be kind of hard to tell, hard to distinguish one that directly relates to the prints, the finished prints. But I think as you're looking at them, you can tell from the stance and from some of the gesture of the figures that he's sketching out where some of these ideas are coming from when you see those finished prints. You can see some of those gestures playing out in the final version as well. So he started engraving these in Italy, but the entire suite would be executed in Nancy when he returned there. And the pieces are done in the manner of the work that he was doing while he was in that village. It seems that he got as far as engraving the title page in Florence, which is inscribed "Made in Florence," and then the year 1616. For whatever reason, we don't know, but the artist then abandoned the project and only completed it upon his return to Nuncy, where he etched all of the other plates in the series as well. And you can see the inscription down there at the bottom right, indicating that they were made and finished in Nuncy. And that was certainly added later when the final set was finally published. So I want to take you through each of these individual prints. We're going to go fairly quickly because there are 21 of them, so we won't spend too much time on any one. But we're starting here with the frontispiece with the title page. Clearly very humorous, clearly meant to be very humorous, and kind of draw us into this world of humor. But we also have our man getting ready to pull his sword. This plate was actually lost a few years after it was engraved. And so there's only one state of this print that exists, and it was never redone. Our hooded small figure hunched over a crutch. Small figure striding forward with cane and bulging abdomen. Small male figure with peg leg and crutch. The drinker, seen from the front. The drinker, seen from the back. Duelist with two sabers. Duelist with sword and dagger. Man with large stomach, adorned with a row of buttons. And man with large back, adorned with a row of buttons. And I hope you can tell as we're going through that much like the actual performances, which were meant to be entertainment and amusing, the prints too are exaggerated and meant to have the viewer experience them in much that same way. They're meant to inspire that same amusement and enjoyment as the viewer is experiencing the print. And here is man with sagging stomach and in a very high hat. Small masked male figure playing a violin. Masked man with twisted legs. The hurdy-gurdy player. Man scraping a grate in the guise of a violin. The flageolet player. The masked comedian playing the guitar. The bagpipe player. The bandy-legged man playing the guitar. And finally, the lute player. And so altogether, when these prints were published, they were distributed widely, and they actually had a pretty strong impact. They kind of inspired this interest in these types of figures, and kind of a whole fashion for them rose up, inspired in part by these prints that Callot created. And so that was expressed in paintings, in other prints like these, but even more so in decorative objects and as well. And so there are actually decorative objects that are inspired by these Callot prints. And so I wanted to show you a couple of examples of these. And these are identified as being after prints by Jacques Callot, not specifically identified with any one print, but I think you can see some of the similarities between these figures and our small Callot prints. So these are from Villeroy, and then this figure as well from Menacee, but both after the prints by Callot. So that was one of the impacts that Callot had just from this series. But his impact was also felt much more broadly, both in the history of printmaking and in the history of art as well. He actually made two innovations in the etching process. And so one of them was actually with that ground that I was talking about before, the resist that's applied to the surface of the metal plate. Um, he's credited with being responsible for an improved recipe for that etching ground that coated the plate. And so instead of the softer ground that was more wax-based, he used lute maker's varnish to create what's called now hard ground. And this was a big deal because it allowed etchers to create very fine lines that then didn't flake off in the acid bath and lead to that acid biting away at areas where you didn't want it to. And it also allowed for lines to be etched more deeply as well. And so they were able to prolong the life of the plate as it was being used in the printing and also reduce that risk of that biting happening as well. So this was important and this was really helpful, not only, for technically allowing them to do different things that they weren't able to do before, but also that risk of biting in the past, biting away at those areas that you didn't want it to. In the past, that had always been so great that a lot of times etchers wouldn't spend too much time on any one plate just because there was every possibility that it may get ruined. And so now they could spend more time on things, they could do more detailed work, and that had previously been the monopoly of engraving. And so that opened up this whole new realm of possibilities, and it was something that Callot used to great effect as well. His other innovation in printmaking, he's also credited with developing this tool, the échoppe. And this was a type of etching needle with a slanting oval section at the end, which enabled etchers to create a swelling line, which is something that engravers were able to do. And now he brought it into the purview of etchers as well. Callot also made extensive and sophisticated use of multiple stoppings out during his printing process. And this is a technique of letting the acid dissolve lightly over the whole plate and then stopping out those parts of the work that the artist wants to keep shallow by covering them with that ground and then bathing the plate in acid again to etch deeper into those areas that he wants to be deeper. So this is something that he made great use of, and it allowed him to create more subtle effects in his work, in the distance that he's able to portray in his work, in the light and shade that he brings into his work. And it's a very carefully controlled process that he made possible through doing all of this work. And actually, he's so important in this history of printmaking that one of his devotees, the Parisian Abraham Boss, would actually spread his innovations all over Europe with the first published manual of etching, which was translated into Italian, Dutch, German, and English. And here you're seeing a few pages from that manual. So he's important in those ways. And of course, he was also very popular in his day as well. He received commissions from many different courts, and people collected his work. He was very popular during his time. So in 1627, the regent of the Spanish Netherlands commissioned Callot to etch 6 large copper plates that joined together to form a bird's eye panorama of the Spanish capture of Breda by Spinola. And this was very well regarded once it was completed. It was considered to be this very vivid combination of the accuracy of a map, but also with the liveliness of news reporting, and that people just really loved it. And so It actually inspired Louis XIII in France to call him to Paris to make similar huge etchings for him as well. But the series that he's perhaps best known for are his works on the miseries of war, the miseries and misfortunes of war. In 1633, he etched six small miseries, and then 18 large miseries in as these two series. And these are probably his most famous prints. And we have some of these in the museum as well. Some of these from the series on the miseries of war. And they're considered to be the first unromantic pictures of war, showing the cruelty of war, the impersonal nature of it, casual violence, and senseless destruction. At the same time, his records of war were thought to be very believable, very kind of objective in their portrayal, dispassionate, but at the same time, very precise and still engaging and detailed in their rendering. So these images show soldiers pillaging and burning their way through towns, country, and convents before being variously arrested and executed by their superiors, lynched by peasants, or surviving to live on as beggars. And at the end, the generals are awarded by their monarch. During 1633, when these were created, and the year that the larger set was published, Lorraine had been invaded by the French during the 30 Years' War. And Callot's artwork is still noted as being among the most powerful artistic statements on the inhumanity of war. And this was also something that other artists took notice of and were inspired by as well. So, another artist who's also well known for his war imagery is Francisco de Goya. And Goya actually owned a series of the prints by Callot. And so his Disasters of War, which you're seeing one of those prints on your screen now, was actually influenced by Callot and from the work that Callot did through his Misery series as well. So a huge influence on a varied cast of artists moving forward as well. And another that was influenced by Callot is Rembrandt. I was mentioning that Callot was commissioned by courts in Lorraine, France, and Spain, and by publishers, mostly in Paris. And although he remained in Nancy, his prints were distributed widely throughout Europe, and they were collected widely as well. And so Rembrandt was a keen collector of these prints. And here I'm showing you one of Rembrandt's prints, which seems like it could have had a little inspiration from one of Callot's as well, since he did so many of these beggar images too. So a huge cast of artists that he influenced, very diverse throughout. I'm hoping that this kind of whirlwind tour through the life of Callot has given you a little context to better help you understand our Gobbi prints here. And hopefully it'll inspire you to step out to the museum to take a look at these in person and give you a little greater appreciation for what's going on with them. So I will end here, but are there any questions for me?
Julie, I have a question for you.
Yeah,
In your research on this set,
yeah.
were you able to find any information about um, whether this set was released as a set or whether they were released individually and collected individually, or was it really sent out as a group?
That's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure. I believe they went out as a set together because we do have the frontispiece, like the title page. And sometimes they're referred to as different pages with different page numbers throughout. And so I think from that they would have been together. But yeah, it would be good to have that kind of spelled out in how they were distributed.
And just as a related question, do we know how many sets might have been made? I know these things weren't nine numbered at the time or anything like that, but I wondered if some scholars who specialized in Callot had
Hmm.
determined or guessed how many are out there sets.
I'm not sure. I did read that the complete sets are somewhat rare to see. Um, I looked a lot at the Met, and they have a full set, possibly a couple of full sets there. They were helpful with some of the detail images for these prints. Um, and other places have some as well. But I think full sets are a bit rare as you're looking at these different places, at least according to one source.
And you may have said this, are these 21, is this a full set?
I believe so. Yes. Yep. That's how that was my understanding as I was reading, and that was seemed like how they were referring to them. And there weren't any sources that showed other prints that I thought would be included that we didn't have here. So I believe this is a full set.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Enjoy.